This is going to be a quick demonstration of how a static type system, in this case TypeScript, can guide you through making a change. So we're going to make a change to the database schema, and then TypeScript is going to sort of guide us through all the different changes we need to make until we've made it all the way to the React front end and the system is working again. So let's begin by looking at the actual system we're going to do this with. This is Execute Program, a website that will help you to learn programming tools fast. And we are going to concern ourselves not with anything that's really core to the application. Whoops, my server is not even running. Uh, I am not prepared. So I just booted our dev process, which is going to run a TypeScript for the client, Webpack, as well as, a TypeScript for the server. They're all warming up now. This is part of using TypeScript. The compiler is not fast to boot, but once these things are all up, the delta on making changes is pretty quick. All right, so that's all running now. Server is ready for requests. So now, if I try that again, we can register, whoops, we already have an A, will be B. And I'm going to click the link in that email, which just went to our console because we're in dev mode. And we will look at the notification settings page. Now, this is just a really boring sort of corner of the system. Are we getting reminder emails or not? But it's a nice, simple example that'll thread us all the way from this checkbox here. We're going to go all the way from that down to the database. Of course, if we change that and save it, it goes all the way to the back end to the database. Speaking of going from the back end to the database, I'm going to really quickly just sort of draw out what this is going to look like. So we're going to, like I said, change the schema in the database. The data from the database flows into our backend server. So what we want is we change this schema, and then we should see type errors in the backend server code because now it doesn't match what's in the database. Then we're going to go over to the front end. Excuse my terrible writing. And once we've changed the backend code, we're going to see type errors in the front end because now the API server is returning something different than what the front-end components expect. This is a React system, so they're going to be React components. And that's because there are these API types, type definitions, that are shared between the front end and the back end. So when they communicate, it goes through those types. They both share those types. And then on the front end, we're going to have, of course, a bunch of React components that are related in various ways. And the particulars of that don't really matter, but the props that come into the front end from the back end are going to flow through this whole tree of components. And so we're going to start here and go all the way over here and up into those components. We could also do the reverse and change a component and then see the changes propagate all the way backwards until they force a database change. But in this case, I'm just starting with the database. Okay, so to begin with, we need to write a migration. Let's step back. What I'm going to do is currently this is a Boolean, which we can see if we look at the users table schema. It is this column on user, subscribe to transaction emails. And you can see it's a Boolean. It's never null. The default is true. So when you make an account, you're subscribed by default. And we're going to change that to not be a Boolean anymore, but rather to be a number. Now, that's going to be weird because it's a checkbox and we're not going to change that. But if we were doing this for real, we would probably replace this checkbox with some kind of multi-option notification setting. In a real system, or this is a real system, but if we were making this change for real to go to production, we would want to alter this column to be a number, and we would want to migrate all the existing Boolean values to be presumably zeros and ones. We're not going to do that just because we're not going to run this in production. So I'm going to say alter table users, drop column, that big name, which I have copied too much of because I was clicking around. And then we will again alter it, but this time we will add that column to be an integer, not null, default of 1 because you are subscribed by default. I think this is going to be a 32-bit signed, if I remember correctly, for Postgres. Doesn't really matter though. Whoops. 2 white spaces. Never want that. Okay, so now we have our migration, and I can actually migrate the system. Now, a few different things are going to happen during that migration. Let's actually look at our migrate script. This is just connects running. We're going to ignore that. The part we care about is right here. So if we're in development mode, which we are, then we run this command, which says schema ts, and this is a tool that will inspect our SQL database schema and generate a TypeScript type definition file that matches the types of the columns. So we're telling it we have a hard-coded path to our dev database just to make sure that even if we somehow ran this in production, we would not be hitting the production database. And we generate this source file. And if we look at that source file, what did I do there? There we go. Look for that column name, which once again I have lost. Copy that from my Postgres. So we have that type being number now. But if we look at a diff of this file, we can see that it used to be Boolean and now it's number. So it was auto-generated to match our database schema change. So we don't have to write this file. We don't have to maintain it. It all happens automatically. Now, you might be wondering, why do you want this TypeScript file that matches your... what is going on here? Is my terminal... My terminal state is broken. All right. It's a number now. And the reason we want that is because the server-side code that talks to the database uses all of these types. It just automatically pulls them in and uses them, which is why if I switch back to my dev console, we have a bunch of type errors now. These were not here before. And these are all because the backend code is now not matched to the database schema, and the system knows that. So that's why we have all this kind of extra machinery, but it allows us to be sure that the server code matches the database. So just to be clear, in our diagram, we just went from here to here. So this is now type erroring, and we need to start fixing those type errors. I'm going to begin with the actual database code, just because I know that's closest to the database. So we're going to open up db user. Nice red underlined error here. Whoops. So if you look at the bottom line of my screen right down here, true is not assignable to number or undefined. Never mind the undefined. That doesn't matter here. So we need to give it something other than true. We're just going to change trues to ones and falses to 0, just because that'll make the errors go away. I'm trying to demonstrate, the type system guiding us. I'm not so much concerned with making the change in a way that would make sense in a production system. Okay. We also have the user test failing. May as well change that. It's going to be easy. False is going to become 0. And now these errors look kind of unreadable here because they're wrapping. If I were on my main monitor that I use for actual development, this would not be wrapping. It's much larger. I have a big font size here and a smaller monitor, so that really kind of gums up the works. And there are also a lot of lines here because there's a whole bunch of code involved. Like this is all one error. But usually what you want to do is look at the last line, and it says number is not assignable to Boolean. So now that I know that, I can look at this file on line 6, and that's here. And so because of the nature of the change I've made, I know that it's going to be right here where we're getting this exact field that we changed out of the database, and we are returning, well, let me step back. So this file is the server-side handler for one of our API endpoints. And you can see the name of it is, this is the notifications page. So this is the endpoint that this page hits when it loads. And we import an API definition that we're going to see in a moment from our common code shared between server and client. We then say, now we're defining the handler for that. And the problem is that what we're returning here has the wrong type. So the type system knows that this thing right here should be a Boolean according to the API type definitions, which we haven't updated yet, but it's getting a number because it's coming straight out of this database field. So let's open a second Vim split, go to the definition of that API object that we're using. Never mind the imports, they're not really important. If you know what IOTS is, you can probably guess what's happening here. If you don't know what it is, don't even worry about it. That's not really the point here. What the point is that the API schema says it wants a Boolean, so we have to change that to number. And then if I go over here, of course, the TypeScript language server is now confused. It has not updated itself for this, so I'm going to kill it, restart it. One of the other downsides of TypeScript is that the language server constantly gets confused when you change one file and go back to another. Anyway, there's no error now, so that error has gone away. And if we look here, we can see that it also is not coming out. There are still these two errors, but that one that we just fixed is gone. Something else to notice here, The client also has some type errors now, and that is because of this shared file being updated over here. So because we updated the shared definition of the API types, the client is now mad because these things don't match. And it's important to note that I don't even have our tests running. I have completely turned our tests off because they are not relevant, useful, or necessary to make this change. We can make this change just with the static types. So you don't have to write any tests to get this. You just have to use TypeScript in the right way. Okay. Let's now keep going with these server-side changes before we worry about the client. Here we are, again, look at the last line on the screen. We are assigning a Boolean to something that should be a number. Probably what we should do here, well, okay, other way around, actually. We're assigning a number to a Boolean. We are modifying the user object here because we are in the API endpoint where we're updating the notifications. So this would be when I hit this button. In fact, let's just watch it actually happen. Can I do that? No, because everything's broken right now. But when I hit this button, it's going to post to this API endpoint here. And so if we look at the definition of that API data, whoops, didn't want to do that. So this is the definition for the incoming data. It has a Boolean coming in. Again, we're just going to say number there. And TypeScript language server is confused, but we can see over here that that short error went away, and now we just have the one long error left. So let's look at that source file, line 10. Basically the same thing, same story now. The one weird thing about this is that we are pulling out the database field, which is a number. We are, again, assigning it to a Boolean, which is wrong. But you can see that I did some really bad naming here. This says subscribe to transactional emails, which is a name that makes sense. This says reminders enabled, which is also a name that makes sense, but they're different names, and I really should change this to be more consistent. Anyway, what we need to do here is the exact same thing we did before. We need to jump into the definition of that API endpoint, find reminders enabled. This one's a little bit different because we have separate definitions of the TypeScript types and the API types. Whoops. So if I change one of them, TypeScript's smart enough, it is smart enough to know that they have to match. So we have to change this one too. And that fixes that. If TypeScript's language server were not confused, that would have fixed this file. I had to kill it again. And now server-side code is building, but client-side code is mad. So going back to our diagram, what we have done, changed the schema, backend got mad, but we fixed all that. But because the backend and the client share these API type definitions, now the client is mad. So all this stuff is type erroring. And really, it's two different components, both of which happen to be page-level components. So there's not a whole hierarchy like I drew here, but in a larger change, you would probably see much more type errors. All right, so what do we want? Notification page. Let's go client, pages, notification. Somewhere in here, there should be a type error. Am I in the wrong thing? Client pages. No, I'm in the right thing. Oh, there it goes. It was just slowly booting itself. So what we have here is an HTML input tag, and it has a checked property, just like it would in regular old HTML, even though we're in React. The React type definitions know the types of all this stuff. So they know that this is supposed to be a Boolean. And if you look at the bottom of my screen, number, which is now what the API is returning, is not assignable to Boolean or undefined. Never mind, that doesn't apply here. We just care about the Boolean part. So what we should do here is replace this checkbox with some kind of tri-state or whatever sort of semantic change we were making our number to allow. But in this case, just to keep things moving, I'm going to say if that's greater than 0, then we're going to check the thing. And here we have the reverse. We're pulling out a checked field from that input and passing it into the API. Ultimately, that's where this is going. We don't need to trace through that. Just know that ultimately this is going to the API. So we will say if that is true, then we're going to say 1. Otherwise, we're going to say 0. And that makes that type error go away. And then finally, the authenticated course page. So client pages, auth course. And unsurprisingly, this is coming out of that reminders enable we changed in the API. Bottom of the screen, same thing. Number is not assignable to Boolean. I'm trying to think about whether I want to dive down into this and change it. Let's do it. So this is passing down into one of our components, not an HTML element. So let's dive down into that. And here's reminders enabled. So we're going to change that from a Boolean to a number. Now, the type error in that other file is gone now, but we have a new one and in this current file. So if we go to, go to the first error, same thing, we're passing this down even farther. So let's go down there and change that to a number. And that made that build. Actually, that made everything build, which is interesting. That must mean we're doing a conditional on it. Yep. So now this is actually a number, but the ternary here is still going to work. Now, it is theoretically possible that we could have changed, if we would have used the numbers in a weird way, like 0 means true and 1 means false, this would have then been wrong. It would have been flipped. So TypeScript can't catch that, and you still have to think about the changes you're making, but it sort of drove us all the way down here. I mean, we've gone through, I don't know, something like 10 or 12 different files. I guess we can look here. So, well, I guess that's more like 9 maybe. Yeah, 9 files. 10 if you include the migration. But at every single point, all we had to do was go where TypeScript told us to go. We didn't have to do any kind of deep analysis on the next change we need to make. Now we've made all those changes. Let's look at it in a browser. Is the server up? Yes, it is. So this should be working. Well, was my database wiped? Yes, I wiped the database. So we can make A again. And there we go. Click the link in the email to log in. Go to our account page, notification page, and I'm going to open up my dev console so we can see what's actually happening here, as well as I'm going to open up my Postgres session again, and we'll select, let's say, email, and what's the name of that? This thing, from users. So right now, it's 1 because you're subscribed by default, and I'm going to now uncheck this, whack this button. If we look here at the API request, we sent a 0, and if we select from the database, we have a 0. So everything worked. Another thing to note, I totally breezed through. I didn't tell you, like, what is the actual system used to define this database code we saw, or what was the API endpoint we were in? I don't even remember. Subscribe, or no, notifications, yeah. Oh no, that's it. Well, good enough. I didn't talk at all about what is this system we're using to define endpoints. All that stuff is specific to execute program, and it's not really important here. So hopefully I didn't trip you up too much. If you're interested in what the heck this application actually is, you can go to executeprogram.com and give it a try. We have courses on various things down here you might be interested in. So I think that's it, and I'll see you next time.